The teak deck of the Castellano Legacy glowed under the Mediterranean moon like a stage set for a tragedy, reflecting a world Zaria had spent 10 years trying to outrun. She stood at the mahogany railing, her fingers tracing the expensive grain, watching the champagne bubbles in her glass dissipate like her hope for a quiet night. Around her, the air was thick with the scent of sea salt and the suffocating entitlement of men who bought people like they bought stocks. Zaria was a shadow in this glittering world, a woman in a silk dress who just wanted to be ordinary, invisible to the predators circling the buffet. Zaria, Bryce's voice didn't just interrupt the music, it bruised the air. Zaria didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She could feel the heat of his arrogance before he even touched her, the rhythmic thud of his Italian loafers against the deck sounding like a countdown. This was a man who had inherited a fortune and lost his soul before the ink on his MBA was dry. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart," Bryce sneered, his words a toxic drip meant only for her. Zaria felt his hand clamp around her upper arm, his grip tightening until her skin pinched against the bone. "Stop pretending you belong here and get out of my sight. You're a blemish on a perfect evening." "I'm leaving, Bryce. Let go," Zaria whispered. The words were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She had spent a decade learning that peace was better than pride, but Bryce mistook her restraint for a lack of teeth. Bryce didn't let go. Instead, he yanked her toward the gangplank, his face twisted into a mask of cruel triumph. He swept past the shocked socialites in a cloud of expensive bourbon and unearned power, dragging Zaria in the wake of his malice. He headed toward the edge of the light, where the dark water waited to swallow her dignity. Bryce was loud, a barking dog in a designer suit, but he was blind to the true apex predator in the room. He didn't notice the music died. He didn't see the two shadows in black suits detach themselves from the bar. And he certainly didn't notice the man in the corner, the one with the whiskey glass and the tattooed knuckles, whose eyes had just turned into flint. Bryce thought he was throwing a nobody into the dark to assert his dominance. He had no idea. He was touching the only thing in this world that Raphael Castellano wouldn't let him pay for with a check. Bryce thinks he's the king of the sea, but he's about to find out there's a shark in the water he never saw coming. If you've ever seen someone mistake kindness for weakness, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below to see what happens when Raphael makes his move. The Mediterranean breeze was supposed to feel like freedom, but to Zaria Rivers, it felt like a cold reminder of everything she was trying to leave behind. She stood on the upper deck of the Castellano Legacy, the sapphire water stretching toward a horizon that promised a life of her own making. For 3 years, she had built a world of spreadsheets and quiet studio apartments, far from the mahogany road offices and blood-stained ledgers of her family's empire. Yet, standing here in a dress of midnight silk, the weight of her brother's world felt as heavy as the diamonds she'd refused to wear. The gala was a sea of calculated smiles and predatory grace. Zaria sipped her mineral water, staying near the shadows of the floral arrangements, trying to blend into the expensive wallpaper. She watched Raphael from a distance, the way the crowd parted for him not out of respect, but out of a survival instinct. He looked every bit the king he was, a silent storm in a bespoke suit, his tattooed hands wrapped around a crystal glass. To the world, he was the devil. To her, he was the brother who used to check under her bed for monsters, unaware that he had eventually become the biggest one of all. "You look like you're waiting for the ship to sink, or for someone to jump overboard." The voice was like a splash of cheap gin in a vintage wine cellar. Zaria didn't have to look up to feel the suffocating ego radiating off the man who had just stepped into her personal space. Bryce Callahan didn't just enter a room, he colonized it. He was tall, his tan a bit too perfect, his smile a jagged edge of white teeth that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned against the railing with a casual arrogance that suggested he'd already appraised the value of everything in his line of sight, including her. "I'm just enjoying the view," Zaria replied, her voice a practiced shield of neutrality. "The view is better from the VIP lounge," Bryce said, his gaze traveling over her with a slow, dismissive heat. "But I suppose not everyone gets an invite to the inner circle. I haven't seen you at the club, and I know everyone who matters in this zip code. Who did you sneak in with? One of the catering staff. He laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that drew the eyes of a few nearby socialites. Bryce took a step closer, his presence looming, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. He didn't see the way Zaria's knuckles whitened as she gripped her glass, nor did he notice the sudden, deathly stillness of the man sitting 20 feet behind him. Bryce only saw a woman he deemed beneath him, a nobody at a party for giants, and he was clearly hungry for a lead role in a drama of his own making. "I'm here on my own merit, Mr. Callahan," she said softly. "Merit," he scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "That's a cute word for a girl like you." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder in a gesture that was more about possession than politeness. The golden cage was tightening, and for the first time in years, Zaria felt the old Castellano fire flickering in her veins, warring with the peace she had fought so hard to find. The condensation on Zaria's glass was the only thing cooler than her composure as Bryce Callahan leaned into her space, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who viewed every no as a temporary glitch in a world designed to serve him. His hand finally settled on the railing, effectively pinning her between the cold steel and his looming frame. "You know, Zaria," he murmured, his voice dropping into a register that was supposed to be intimate but felt like a threat. "I have a private deck on the starboard side. Better champagne, fewer eyes, and a host who knows how to appreciate a woman who looks that good in silk. Why don't we leave this crowd to their boring small talk?" Zaria didn't flinch. She had seen this look 1,000 times in her brother's world, the look of a man who mistook silence for an invitation. She set her glass down on the railing with a deliberate, steady click. "Thank you for the offer, Bryce, but I'm perfectly content right here. I prefer the open air." The rejection was polite, surgical, and absolute. For a heartbeat, the mask of the charming venture capitalist slipped, revealing a flash of jagged resentment. Bryce wasn't used to being handled. He was used to being obeyed. He let out a sharp, dry chuckle that carried across the deck, snagging the attention of a group of socialites nearby. "Content," he repeated, his voice rising just enough to ensure an audience. "Is that what we're calling it? You're standing here like a wallflower in a dress you clearly can't afford, acting like you're too good for the best seat in the house." He took a deliberate step closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room to make sure people were watching. Be honest. You're only here because someone forgot to check the guest list at the gangplank. You should be grateful I'm even talking to you." The whispers among the guests began, a low, buzzing sound that felt like stinging gnats. Zaria felt the heat crawl up her neck, not from shame, but from the sheer, suffocating weight of his entitlement. She could feel Raphael's gaze from across the deck, a heavy, silent pressure that warned her the peace she had fought for was fraying at the edges. "I think you've had enough to drink, Bryce," Zaria said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet edge. "You should walk away before you say something you can't take back." "Or what?" Bryce sneered, stepping fully into her light, his face twisting into a sneer of pure disdain. "You'll call security. I am security in this town. People like you are just background noise to people like me. You're lucky I don't have you tossed overboard just for the sport of it." He reached out, his fingers twitching as if to grab her arm again, fueled by the audience's hushed gasps. He thought he was the lion in this arena, unaware that he was standing in a cage with a predator who hadn't even stood up yet. From the elevated mezzanine, the air was thinner, colder, and saturated with the quiet authority that Raphael Castellano wore like a second skin. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the vibrant gala lights below. To the passing waiters and the oblivious elite, he was merely a statue of power, a man whose presence commanded a wide, respectful berth. But beneath the surface of his calm, a rhythmic, dangerous tension was building. His thumb traced the rim of his crystal glass, the ice within rattling softly, a sound that mimicked the sharpening of a blade. He had promised Zaria this night. He had promised to be a ghost, a silent benefactor who would allow her to exist in the light without the shadow of the Castellano name looming over her. It was a pact born of love and a rare, agonizing respect for her independence. He wanted her to be more than a mobster's sister. He wanted her to be the woman who could walk through a room and be seen for her own brilliance. But as he watched Bryce Callahan's aggressive frame invade her space, the promise felt like a lead weight in his chest. From his vantage point, Raphael could see the micro-expressions Bryce was too arrogant to notice. He saw the way Zaria's shoulders squared, the way her chin tilted, not in fear, but in the restrained dignity of a woman who had been raised by wolves but chose to be a lamb. He saw Bryce's mouth move, the ugly sneer of his lips visible even from the mezzanine. He saw the moment Bryce's hand moved toward her again, a gesture of ownership that made the air in the room feel suddenly, violently combustible. Raphael's grip on his glass tightened until his knuckles turned a ghostly white, the ink of the tattoos on his fingers stretching over the bone. His bodyguards, two silent pillars of shadow standing just behind him, shifted almost imperceptibly. They didn't need a command. They could feel the temperature in the room dropping. They knew the look in Raphael's eyes, the flinty, unblinking stare of a predator who had just identified a target that didn't know it was dead yet. He wanted to believe she could handle it. He wanted to honor her strength. But as Bryce's voice rose, cutting through the jazz and the clinking of silverware like a jagged shard of glass, Raphael felt the last thread of his restraint snap. The whiskey in his glass remained untouched, but the fire in his veins was already burning white-hot. He didn't stand up yet. He remained in the shadows, a silent, gathering storm, waiting for the one move from Bryce that would forfeit the man's right to walk off the ship on his own 2 feet. The salt air, once refreshing, now felt like it was thickening, clotting in the back of Zaria's throat as Bryce Callahan's face contorted into something unrecognizable. The veneer of the visionary investor had vanished, replaced by the jagged, raw nerves of a man whose vanity had been bruised. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a glitch in his reality, a servant who had dared to speak back to the master. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Bryce's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a low, vibrating growl that cut through the ambient jazz of the deck. He stepped into her personal space, the smell of bourbon now a suffocating cloud. "You stand here in your little summer dress, acting like you belong among the giants. You're nothing but a bottom feeder, Zaria. A gold digger who couldn't even find a shovel, so you're trying to claw your way into the VIP lounge with that pathetic, high-end mighty act." Zaria took a step back, her heels clicking sharply against the teak wood. "Bryce, you're making a scene. Walk away." "I'll walk away when I've put the trash where it belongs," he spat. Before she could react, his hand shot out like a viper, his fingers locking around her wrist with a bruising force. The shock of the contact sent a jolt of cold lightning up her spine. This wasn't the clumsy grab of a drunk. This was the deliberate, physical assertion of a man who believed he owned the very air she breathed. "Let go of me," Zaria commanded, her voice vibrating with a lethal, suppressed intensity. "Make me," Bryce sneered, his eyes wild with the thrill of his own perceived power. He gave her arm a violent yank, stumbling her forward. The surrounding guests gasped, a ripple of hushed horror moving through the silk and sequins, but no one moved. Bryce was a donor, a board member, a king in their shallow world. They watched as if it were a performance, a spectacle of discipline. He began to drag her, her heels skidding across the polished deck toward the gangplank stairs. "You want to be independent? Fine. Go be independent on the pier with the rest of the stowaways." Each step he took was a hammer blow to the peace Zaria had spent years building. She looked past him, her eyes instinctively finding the mezzanine. In the flickering light of the Swarovski lanterns, she saw the silhouette move. The whiskey glass was gone. The man in the black suit was no longer sitting. Bryce thought he was dragging a victim to the edge of the world. He had no idea he was dragging a match toward a powder keg, and the fuse had just run out. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound. It was the breath the world takes right before a storm breaks. The jazz quartet's upbeat tempo didn't just fade. It severed, the final note of the saxophone hanging in the air like a bated breath before dying into a suffocating silence. The sudden absence of sound was more violent than a scream. Across the deck, the glittering elite of the city froze, their champagne flutes hovering midair, their practiced laughter dying in their throats. It was the kind of silence that preceded a landslide, heavy, absolute, and terrifying. Bryce Callahan, however, was too intoxicated by his own perceived dominance to hear the warning. He still had his fingers dug into Zaria's wrist, his face twisted in a mask of petty triumph as he dragged her toward the gangplank stairs. He didn't notice that the catering staff had backed against the railings, or that the air had suddenly dropped 10 degrees. "What's with the music?" Bryce barked, his voice echoing off the mahogany bulkheads with an ugly, hollow ring. He stopped at the top of the stairs and looked around, expecting a technician to come scurrying forward with an apology. "I'm paying for a gala, not a funeral. Get the band back on." He didn't get an answer from the band. Instead, the heavy thud of leather soles against the teak deck began to pulse from the shadows. From the mezzanine stairs and the stern entrance, two groups of men in identical black suits and light-blocking sunglasses moved with a synchronized, predatory grace. They didn't run. They drifted into position, forming a human perimeter that effectively sealed the yacht from the world. The exits were no longer passages. They were barricades. Bryce sneered, tightening his grip on Zaria until she winced. "Security? Good. Finally, this woman is trespassing. Get her off my boat before I have your jobs." The bodyguards didn't look at Bryce. They didn't even acknowledge his existence. Their eyes were fixed on a point just behind him, their posture as rigid as statues. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running beneath his ear, stepped forward and placed a hand on the velvet rope of the gangplank, clicking the silver latch shut. Zaria stood perfectly still, her eyes meeting Raphael's as he finally emerged from the mezzanine shadows. The whiskey glass was gone, replaced by a terrifying, empty-handed readiness. Bryce, oblivious to the fact that the security he was ordering around were actually high-ranking captains of the Castellano family, let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Did you hear me? I said move." Bryce shoved Zaria toward the nearest guard, expecting the man to catch her like a sack of refuse. The guard didn't move an inch. He simply stared through Bryce with the vacant, chilling gaze of a man who had seen 1,000 souls leave their bodies. At that moment, the first hairline fracture appeared in Bryce's confidence. He looked at the silent guests, then at the blocked exits, and finally at the man in the black suit descending the stairs with the slow, rhythmic gait of an executioner. Bryce still thought he was the most important man in the room, but for the first time, he noticed that no one was looking at him. They were all looking at the monster he had accidentally summoned. The air on the deck didn't just feel still. It felt frozen, a brittle glass floor that Bryce Callahan was currently stomping on with heavy, oblivious boots. He was still red-faced, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own temper, looking around at the silent, stone-faced guards as if he could still bully his way into a position of authority. "What is this, a joke?" Bryce shouted, his voice cracking against the silence. He turned back to Zaria, his fingers digging deeper into her arm. "Is this your little circus, sweetheart? Did you hire these thugs to impress me? You're more desperate than I thought." He let out a jagged, mocking laugh, but it died instantly when a voice cut through the salt air. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It was a low, resonant baritone that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Take your hands off her." The words came from the man who had finally reached the base of the mezzanine stairs. Raphael Castellano stepped into the circle of light, his presence casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire yacht. He didn't look like a host anymore. He looked like the end of the world. Bryce's sneer faltered. He recognized the suit, the posture, and the terrifying, unblinking intensity of the man walking toward him. "Castellano," Bryce stammered, his grip on Zaria loosening just a fraction. "Listen, I was just handling a situation for you. This girl, she's a fraud. She's trespassing. I was just throwing out the trash." Raphael stopped 3 feet away. He didn't look at Bryce. His eyes were fixed on the bruised skin of Zaria's wrist, and then they slowly traveled up to her face. For a fleeting second, the cold flint in his gaze softened into something ancient and fiercely protective. Then he turned that gaze back to Bryce. "You call her trash again," Raphael said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the guests at the back of the deck shiver. "And I will personally ensure you never speak another word." "Raphael, wait," Zaria said, her voice steady but weary. "I told you I could handle this." "You shouldn't have to handle a dog in my house, Zaria," Raphael replied. He looked back at Bryce, whose face was rapidly losing its flush, turning a sickly ashen gray. You think you know everyone who matters in this zip code, Bryce? You think you can appraise the value of every person in this room? Raphael took one final step forward, invading Bryce's space until the taller man had to lean back against the railing. Raphael leaned in, his tattooed knuckles brushing against Bryce's expensive lapel. "Let me introduce you to the woman you're dragging across my deck," Raphael murmured. "This is Zaria Rivers. She shares my blood, she shares my name, and she is the only thing on this earth I actually give a damn about." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd. The gold digger was a princess. The nobody was the queen of the Castellano legacy. Bryce's hand snapped away from Zaria's arm as if he just touched a live wire. His mouth hung open, his knees visibly trembling. The arrogant venture capitalist was gone, replaced by a man who realized he had just poked a lion in the eye while standing in its den. The silence on the deck was no longer the absence of sound. It was the weight of a physical presence, pressing the air out of Bryce's lungs. Raphael didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply pulled a slim, black smartphone from his inner pocket, the screen's cold glow illuminating the sharp, predatory angles of his face. He looked at the device with the detached boredom of a man checking the weather, while Bryce stood frozen, his face the color of wet parchment. "You like to talk about status, Bryce," Raphael murmured, his thumb hovering over the screen. "You like to talk about who matters and who is background noise. You think your venture capital fund makes you a giant. But in my world, you're just a line of code that can be deleted." Bryce tried to swallow, but his throat had turned to sand. "Raphael, please. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know." "You didn't know she was a Castellano," Raphael interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a lethal vibration. "Which means you thought it was perfectly acceptable to put your hands on her because you thought she was nobody. That is the price you're about to pay." Raphael tapped the screen 3 times. The movements were casual, almost rhythmic. "First, the Callahan Fund. I've just released the audit trail of your offshore holdings to the SEC. By the time we reach the pier, your assets will be frozen. Second, your board seat at Meridian. They've just received the footage of you dragging my sister across this deck. They value their reputation more than your ego." A soft ping echoed from Bryce's own pocket. Then another, and another. A frantic symphony of notifications began to vibrate against his hip, the digital death knell of a lifetime of greed. Bryce reached for his phone with trembling fingers, his eyes widening as he scrolled through the wreckage. His partnerships were dissolving in real time. His investors were fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. "In 60 seconds, Bryce, you've gone from a king to a cautionary tale," Raphael said, finally looking up from his phone. His eyes were as empty as the abyss. "I don't need a gun to erase a man like you. I just need to show the world who you really are when the lights come up." Zaria watched the light die in Bryce's eyes, a hollow sense of justice settling in her chest. The man who had tried to throw her off the yacht was now sinking into a sea of his own making, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to throw him a lifeline. The vibration of Bryce's phone had become a death rattle, a frantic buzzing that signaled the total collapse of his curated existence. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a hollowed-out version of the man who had been barking orders only minutes ago. As the weight of Raphael's digital execution settled in, Bryce's knees finally buckled. He didn't fall, but he sagged against the mahogany railing, the same railing he had tried to use as a weapon against Zaria. "Raphael, please," Bryce wheezed, his voice cracking like dry parchment. I didn't know. You have to understand, I thought she was. I was just trying to protect the integrity of your event. I can fix this. I'll make a public apology. I'll donate to any charity she wants. Just call them back. Tell them it was a mistake." Raphael didn't answer. He didn't even look at the man. He simply stepped back, folding his arms, and shifted his gaze to Zaria. He was handing her the blade, silently asking if she wanted to finish what Bryce had started. Bryce turned his desperate, watery eyes toward Zaria. "Zaria, please, you're a good person. I can see it in you. You aren't like him. Don't let him ruin my life over a misunderstanding. I was stressed. I'd had too much to drink. You know how it is at these things. Tell him to stop, please." Zaria looked at him, and for a moment the guests held their breath, expecting the mercy she had been known for. She looked at the bruising grip marks still darkening her wrist, then up at the man who had called her a bottom feeder, while the world watched. The warmth that usually lived in her eyes had been replaced by a familiar, chilling stillness, the Castellano legacy she had tried so hard to bury. "You aren't sorry you hurt me, Bryce," Zaria said, her voice so calm it felt like a razor edge. "You're only sorry you chose a victim who had a bigger shadow than yours." She took a slow step toward him, forcing him to shrink back into the steel. "You talked about merit and status. You thought you were a giant because you had a bank account and a loud voice. But true power isn't about who you can crush. It's about who you don't have to crush to feel big." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "My brother didn't destroy your life, Bryce. He just took away the mask you were using to hide how small you really are. Enjoy the silence on the pier." She turned away without a backward glance, the silk of her dress snapping in the wind. Bryce reached out a trembling hand, but a shadow stepped between them. Raphael's lead bodyguard placed a heavy, gloved hand on Bryce's chest, a silent promise of what would happen if he moved. The hum of the yacht's engines felt deeper now, a low thrum of power that seemed to vibrate in sync with the new atmosphere on deck. Bryce Callahan was no longer a man. He was a slumped, broken shadow being ushered toward the gangplank by two of Raphael's silent sentinels. He didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He simply moved with the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had seen his entire world evaporate in a single minute. As his expensive loafers hit the dock, the heavy iron gate of the pier hissed shut behind him, a sound that resonated like a tomb closing. On deck, the silence remained, but its quality had shifted. It was no longer the silence of shock, but of realization. The elite guests, the CEOs, the heiresses, and the power brokers, stood perfectly still, their eyes darting between Raphael and the woman they had spent the evening ignoring. They watched as Zaria smoothed the silk of her dress, her movements possessing a sudden, lethal grace that they now recognized as a family trait. The nobody they had whispered about was the only person in the harbor who truly mattered. Raphael stepped to the center of the deck, his presence expanding to fill every inch of the luxury vessel. He didn't need a microphone to command the room. He simply looked at the crowd, his gaze a cold warning that made the most powerful men in the city lower their eyes. "The gala will continue," Raphael announced, his voice a calm ripple across the still water. "But let us be clear about the nature of the hospitality you are enjoying tonight. This yacht, this empire, and every debt you owe within this city, they do not belong to me alone." He reached out his hand, and for the first time in years, Zaria didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her fingers sliding into his. The tattooed knuckles of the king met the steady, resilient hand of the sister who had finally stopped running. "Zaria is not a guest in the Castellano house," Raphael continued, his voice echoing off the glass and steel of the skyline. "She is the house. If you speak to her, you speak to me. If you look at her, you look at the future of everything I've built. From tonight, we rule together." A collective breath was released, followed by the tentative, rhythmic sound of applause that quickly grew into a roar of desperate approval. The power structure of the city had tilted on its axis in a single evening. The guests scrambled to adjust, their faces twisting into masks of newfound adoration, but Zaria saw right through them. She stood tall at her brother's side, no longer a ghost in the shadows, but a co-architect of the new order. The Mediterranean moon caught the light in her eyes, reflecting not the fear of the past, but the cold, beautiful clarity of a queen who had finally claimed her throne. The wake of the yacht cut through the dark Mediterranean waters, leaving a trail of white foam that glittered under the moon like scattered diamonds. On the deck, the atmosphere had settled into a heavy, respectful hum. The predatory socialites who had once looked through Zaria now watched her with a reverence usually reserved for the divine or the dangerous. Standing beside Raphael, her hand still resting firmly in his, Zaria realized that the silence she had once used as a hiding place had transformed into a throne. This final transition was not about the return of her family's wealth, but the reclamation of her own identity. For years, Zaria had viewed the Castellano name as a stain she needed to scrub away, much like the floors of her past. She had mistaken her brother's world for a prison, failing to see that the same steel that makes a cage also makes a shield. As she looked out at the city lights, she understood that her quietness wasn't a sign of submission. It was the calm of a storm that didn't need thunder to prove its power. The story of Zaria and Raphael serves as a visceral lesson in the mechanics of true authority. It teaches that power is quiet and observant, while insecurity, personified by men like Bryce Callahan, is loud, aggressive, and ultimately hollow. Bryce sought to demand respect through physical force and social posturing, only to find that such things are easily dismantled by those who have earned their position through character and unwavering loyalty. It is a reminder to never judge a person's worth by their outward quietness, for you never know the strength of the convictions or the family that stands directly behind them. Respect is not a garment you put on to impress others. It is a bond forged in the fire of shared history and mutual protection. As the Castellano legacy turned back toward the harbor, Zaria didn't feel like a victim who had been rescued. She felt like a survivor who had finally accepted her armor. The shadows of her past were no longer something to fear. They were the very thing that ensured her future would be lived in the light, on her own terms, with a king at her side and the world at her feet. Zaria learned that her family's shadow wasn't a prison. It was a shield. In a world where everyone is shouting for attention, she proved that the most powerful person in the room is often the one who says the least. Would you have let Raphael handle Bryce his way, or would you have walked away and left the past behind? Comment your choice below and subscribe to join our community for the next chapter of the Castellano legacy.